Hello, everybody. My name is Mila Kaplan, and I am a member of USA for Israeli Democracy. We provide the most comprehensive information in English to explain the risks to Israeli democracy during wartime, to refute disinformation about the October 7th Hamas attack, to combat anti-Semitism, and to help to get the hostages released. You can find this information on our website, on our YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok pages, which are all available thanks to our contributors, translators, and web and social media curators. To stay informed on a daily basis, feel free to join our WhatsApp groups, and you will receive frequent updates. USA for Israeli Democracy is not affiliated with any other group or political organization. We are of varying political persuasions and religious beliefs. We are Israeli expats, US born, all working for one goal: to support a strong and democratic Israel. And today we are proud to welcome Professor Yael Sternhell. Professor Sternhell, Yael, is a teacher of history and American studies at Tel Aviv University. She is a board member at the New Israel Fund and a frequent Israeli contributor of commentary on American affairs. She is an expert on 19th century US history and the history of modern societies at war. So we are very, very happy to welcome Dr. Sternhell, who will give us her insight about the 2024 US presidential elections and their implications for Israel and the Middle East. We will begin our webinar with an interview, really not an interview, an overview to be given by Dr. Sternhell. Then we will have questions and answers from the audience, and you can submit questions and answers through our Q&A feature. Good afternoon, Yael. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that it's my pleasure, and thank you for all the work you do on our behalf.
Well, it's very nice to be here in the same time zone as you, and not in the same city, but in the same time zone. As an historian, you've spent many years studying and writing about the American Civil War and other modern wars. Can you bring your historical perspective to explain what is happening now in Israel and the US as we approach a very controversial election between Biden and Trump?
Right. So Israel's war with Hamas has reached a kind of unfortunate stalemate. The army estimated today that it's going to take another 6 months to dismantle Hamas. Those of us who watch the movements of the Israeli military in Gaza with concern and unease, and often a sense of guilt and shame about the humanitarian catastrophe Israel is causing in Gaza. For those of us, this is to be honest, pretty depressing estimate by the IDF, which also pertains to many loved ones who are in reserve service or are being called into reserve service, some for the second or third time. I don't know how this can be sustained. I do also want to point out that for many military analysts like Ronen Bergman, who just won the Pulitzer Prize with the New York Times staff, the war has been over since January. I mean, what is happening now is really sort of small-scale operations by the Israeli army to rid Gaza of Hamas presence. But those actions come at a great toll to human life and to just all forms of suffering. And frankly, I don't really see what the way out is. And I think for those of us living here, that's the ultimate concern. Not only are we just watching in horror what's happening in Gaza And not only are we demonstrating with the families of the hostages to strike a deal, even if it means relinquishing some of Israel's stated war aims, we also don't see what the larger outcome of this war is, and what all of this really comes down to, other than perpetuating the reign of Mr. Netanyahu, our prime minister. Which of course brings me to the US, because for those of us living here, President Biden has been throughout this conflict an anchor of stability and sanity, the responsible adult in the room, a source of comfort at a time in which our own government can offer us absolutely no comfort. I was on a similar Zoom with you all, I don't know, what was it, a year ago or so, regarding the judicial overhaul. These people have really managed to run the country into the ground in many different ways. And so for us, President Biden and the ways in which he has supported Israel, and the way he has created the kind of military umbrella that has allowed Israel to survive the Iranian attack of October 14th, is simply an indispensable presence. And I and many others in the Israeli center left absolutely dread the possibility that Biden will lose the election in November, and the person who will come in his stead is both an extremely unstable and unreliable global leader, and that is putting it very mildly. And you do not need me here in Tel Aviv to tell you who Donald Trump is. But as far as those of us living here are concerned, I'm not going to go into how I feel about him as an insurrectionist, because that veers into my expertise as a U.S. historian. But for those of us living in Israel, Trump is an entirely unexpected leader who will very easily abandon Israel if the optics are not right. Trump is obsessed with optics, and the optics of Israel's war since October 7th have been terrible. Both the defeat of October 7th, and we need to call it what it is. Israel was defeated on October 7th. It was unable to protect its borders and to protect its civilian population from a large-scale terrorist attack. And that does not work for Trump. So he doesn't like losers. He doesn't like bad optics. The war in Gaza is all bad optics, right? It photographs terribly. He has said as much. He doesn't care about the human toll in Gaza. He only cares about what it looks like, and it doesn't look good. And Trump is at heart an isolationist. And I think Trump will have absolutely no qualms about abandoning Israel if it is once again attacked by a regional rival. If Iran goes after Israel once more, regardless of course, the attack of April 14 was triggered by Israel's own attack on a senior Iranian official. Trust me, I know the background and I'm familiar with it. The last thing that I want to do here is defend Israeli national security decisions, which I honestly, most of the time, simply do not understand. But that night of April 14th could have been the beginning of the end for Israel. And President Biden made sure that was not the case, and really launched a coalition of regional partners that I think, for me, more than anything else, just showed the immense potential for what regional alliances of the more moderate and sane powers in the Middle East can achieve together when we work together for safety, for security, In some ways, that was such a hopeful moment for the Middle East. And I simply could not understand an Israeli who woke up on that Sunday morning, and didn't say, please, I will sign anything, any peace agreement, any regional alliance. I will give anything. I will give you East Jerusalem and West Jerusalem and, all of it, just to maintain and sustain this kind of regional defense web that saved Israel from 300 and some Iranian missiles and drones. And so I don't know what would happen next time Iran tries something like this, and President Biden is not the one making decisions in the Oval Office. I also want to remind everyone that Trump holds a grudge against Netanyahu because he acknowledged Biden's victory. I am also very fearful of the departures from the civil service, which will surely happen if Trump assumes power again. Trump is making no secret of the fact that he would like to hollow out the civil service, and what this will mean for national security, both of the United States, but of Israel as well, is enormously dangerous. The State Department, the Department of Defense, this entire conglomerate of forces that, for all its problems and mistakes and bad decisions and terrible wars that the United States has gotten into, they've kept the world pretty stable for a while. And, that's not something to take for granted, and that's not something to throw away at a moment of anger at President Biden. I honestly feel much of the time that Americans will survive another Trump administration because of federalism, because most of life is lived in the states. I do not need to tell all of you that, but this is extremely meaningful, that effective governors, state legislatures, effective civil service mechanisms in the states will keep most Americans, especially if they're citizens or documented immigrants, in a state that will allow them to go through another get through another 4 years of a Trump administration and survive. I honestly am not sure that Israel will survive another Trump administration. I think that the region is chaotic. It could get much more chaotic, and Trump's particular brand of chaos, if brought to the Middle East, can actually create here a catastrophe that Gaza would only be the prelude to. And so I can tell you that for civil society groups in Israel right now, a possible Trump victory is seen as the worst possible scenario. And there are civil society groups working on ideas for resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for putting constructive international pressure on Israel, that see November as a deadline, and that say, after November, all bets are off. And this is the point in which I want to bring the fact that the Biden administration is finally, many years after we in the human rights camp in Israel have started lobbying for it, the Biden administration is finally using its powers of sanction against the radical elements of the settler movement in a way that could have a real impact and that could show Israelis what it means to get on the bad side of an American administration. And these are extremely important initiatives that already have and will have even further meaning and impact on the ground in the occupied territories. We know that if Trump assumes power again, that this initiative, this movement towards limiting and asking for accountability of the Israeli settler movement will stop. And that's once again simply something that we cannot afford. And that's another reason to absolutely dread another Trump administration. Now, I know that for many in the US, the current environment on American campuses and the way that it is seen as being moved by the or forces within the Democratic Party or the progressive movement. These are alarming scenes and alarming sights, and that people react to them very emotionally. I know that I react to them very emotionally. As a committed Israeli leftist, it's often very hard for me to see and to feel so abandoned by people I thought were our partners and allies. And I thought that we were in this together to create a better and just region here for everyone. And it's not easy. Some of these slogans, some of these signs, some of the documents produced by Students for Justice in Palestine are not easy for me either. However, I do want to say that the Republican Party, as far as I'm concerned, is not the answer. And as a historian of the US, I am fully aware of the Republican Party's, or let's say the American rights tradition of anti-Semitism, and that I simply cannot buy the kind of newly found energy in the Republican Party to fight anti-Semitism, because I saw none of that energy in previous occasions when anti-Semitism came from the right. And I think President Biden is in a really tough spot here. And I think that his public utterances, his public statements about the campus protests have really tried to walk a fine line between speaking to the Democratic Party's young constituency, but without condoning violence, with making it very clear that he wants to set ground rules, or that he sees a clear line separating legitimate and illegitimate protest. And I think, I have a lot of sympathy for what he's facing. And I really do want, at least, I can only give the view from Tel Aviv, which is that he is trying very hard to both support the Israeli public without supporting the government. He's trying to limit the war in a way that has been honestly ineffective. But, the crazy thing is that American administrations have been much less influential in limiting Israeli policies, basically since 1948. We always see the United States as this great region, great global power, and Israel as a small satellite state. And, every peace negotiator coming from the United States, and Aaron David Miller who's a fellow board member at NIF with me, has some great tidbits about this in his book about his life as an American peacemaker, failed peacemaker. These American negotiators come into the region thinking, we're going to call the shots here. We're the big boss. And then they find out that it just doesn't work that way, that neither Israelis nor Palestinians are willing to follow the rules that Americans would like to set, that they're unwilling to come along on various journeys for peacemaking that American administrations are trying to lead. And in some ways, the difficulties that President Biden is facing right now in, for example, limiting Israel's the IDF's action in Rafah is very typical of American inability to force Israel to follow the policies that the United States or that American administrations would like to implement and to advance. And so, I would be thrilled if President Biden would make Israel stop this war, which I heartily believe needs to be stopped, that needed to be stopped a while ago. But I think the fact that he's unable to do it, and that at the end of the day, another Israeli government is just going its own way, and the United States finds itself having to make an impossible choice between truly abandoning Israel and staying the course with a government with which it does not agree. That's actually not as rare and not specific to the Biden administration. Again, those with longer memories know that the United States has faced similar limitations and similar frustrations with previous Israeli governments, even ones which were much less extreme and in which the US government had more of a collaborative relationship than it does with this government. I do want to say that at this moment of real despair, and I mean, I see many Israeli names among participants, and you all follow the same feeds and news organizations that I do, and you know what's happening here. This is the most difficult moment in the history of Zionism. And it's really quite very difficult to live through it here. In a way that's sort of more complicated than it may seem. Day-to-day life in Tel Aviv is fairly normal. And yet there's just this kind of sense of doom and heaviness, and at least for me as a committed humanitarian, a terrible sense of guilt and shame about the human toll in Gaza. And I think that honestly, the only hope to emerge out of this disaster of a war and see a better future ahead is if the Biden administration follows through with a regional peace deal that would force Israel to make very serious concessions, that will force elections here in Israel, in fact, which is, the first step towards emerging out of this catastrophe, is to get rid of this particular government. And I'm not, unlike others, I don't think this country's problem starts and ends with Netanyahu. The Israeli public has shifted to the right in horrible ways, I have to say, and it will need to shift back. It will need to go through transformation, to adopt a new sense of itself, of its place in this region, of its relationship with Palestinians, who are our neighbors and not just our enemies. And there's a great deal of work to do, but that work starts with a new election, and it starts with some kind of prospect. And so, I don't like Saudi Arabia. I don't like MBS. These are not my dream partners for peace. But currently, that slim hope that the United States will be able to pull through with a regional peace deal that will basically allow us to start from scratch is the only hope we have at the moment, or the only way out that I see out of the current predicament. And so I really am trying to hold on to the hope that Biden will win in November. And I've seen the recent polls, and I know how alarming they are. And I have to say, no one is going to suffer more than Ukrainians and Israelis and Palestinians if that happens. And so I am, hanging on to this notion that disaster will be averted in November, and that given a new mandate from the American public, Biden will be bold and vigorous in its pursuit of a regional peace deal that will somehow allow for a new beginning. And I know all the limitations of leadership on both sides. I know that the Palestinian Authority is a mess. I know that there's no one to govern Gaza. I mean, all the points of pessimism and frustration and hopelessness I'm deeply aware of, but we also need some hope, because there are 15 million people living here between the river and the sea, and somehow they need to work it out. No one is going anywhere. Despite what some of the campus protesters are saying, no one is going anywhere. And I don't think we're going to have a better shot than Biden, than his administration, than his team at trying to achieve this. And so Israel will have a great deal of work to do, but in some ways, the first step is making sure that Biden is reelected in November.
That makes that makes sense to me. I hope the same thing.
So Mila, I know that you have a bunch of questions that you want to ask, and I'm happy to to address them. There are a lot of issues on the table, and I just I want to give the audience the opportunity to discuss the issues that audience members feel are the most pertinent and pressing.
Okay, great. We have some questions that we received earlier, and we have some questions that have just been coming in. So let's start with assuming that or sort of focusing on Biden's current administration. Should American Jews be worried about the Biden administration restricting arms to Israel? And do you think Republicans would provide Israel with arms without accountability? And which is better for the U.S. and for Israel?
Well, I am not worried about that at all. And I think with this current government in Israel, an armament restriction is absolutely called for and necessary. It is a profoundly irresponsible, I want to say unhinged government, with a prime minister, and you all know this, facing 3 criminal indictments and largely controlled by the extreme right, with people whose positions on the issues are honestly KKK. And so any control that the Biden administration can exert on this government, as far as I'm concerned, is absolutely justified. And honestly, I trust the judgment of Biden and Secretary Blinken and Jake Sullivan and their team of sane and reasonable and fundamental humanistic statesmen and bureaucrats much more than I trust the judgment of the people running the show here. So I don't think it's something to be concerned about. I don't know what Republicans will do, simply because I don't know, on which side Donald Trump will wake up on any given morning. Will it be the isolationist? I don't care, the whole world, go to hell? Or is it the, oh yeah, let's help Israel, kill as many Arabs as it can? And so, I think there's a real black hole in the future of United States foreign policy if Donald Trump is reelected, because we just don't know which direction it will take, but it will certainly not be the kind of direction that we need here in the region, which is a steady hand, which sees both sides and has the interests of both sides in mind, and is willing to work hard and do this sort of often thankless and hopeless work of trying to bring them together. So I don't, Israel getting more arms is not going to solve the problem. And especially, I do want to say that Biden's restrictions of arming Israel was very specific and did not include restricting the sales of arms that are defensive in nature. It's the offensive weapons that honestly Israel should not be getting, because Israel should wrap up this war, which is honestly going nowhere and is causing untold human suffering with very modest, if some would say non-existent gains.
Okay. Historically, did Jews in the U.S. Fare better in isolationist periods or during more interventionist times? And do you think we would see a rise in anti-Semitism under a new Trump administration with increased domestic polarization and isolationist policies abroad?
Listen, I mean, the most crucial day in Jewish history was January 1st of modern Jewish history is January 1st, 1925, which is the first day in which the Johnson Act of 1924, which restricted the immigration of, let's say, non-WASPs into the United States, came into effect. The law was passed in 1924, and it came into effect January 1st, 1925. This was the reason Jews could not escape Europe. That's the reason my own family in Poland couldn't escape to the United States. It was a moment of just enormous both isolationism, but also racism and xenophobia. And this is the United States at its absolute worst. And for sure, when the United States is in the world, is invested in world peace, when it cares about other peoples and see global prosperity as an American obligation, then yes, Jews fare better both in Israel and in the United States. An isolationist United States, which will leave these voids into which Russia and China will come in, is dangerous for both Israel and the US and honestly every other Western democracy. It's we don't have much left from the post-war world order, and which makes it, in my mind, even more urgent to cling to what we have, which is America's willingness to be active in the world. And so I very much I am very much a pro interventionist approach from the United States, though of course I mean I'm aware of the many disasters, including the Vietnam War and and numerous other attempts that went badly. Iraq was an inexcusable disaster. The war in Afghanistan was managed poorly. Interventionism needs to be managed well and needs to be done for the right reasons. And the Vietnam War was not interventionism for the right reasons. But I do think that this specific set of people in power now is capable of making rational decisions that see beyond a kind of a very narrow American interest and thinking more globally about our connected well-beings. Jews in the United States are not going to gain from what will happen after November. I honestly, as an expert on the U.S. Civil War, I dread a civil war in America, both if Trump wins or if he loses. And I think at this point, I don't think states won't secede. Some states will threaten to secede, but they won't, because that's been tried and did not work so well. History never repeats itself in the exact same patterns. But what I do see, and I think anyone who looks at January 6th, 2021 needs to, honestly realize or reckon with that the potential for small-scale militia-style violence across the United States with increased polarization and with another contested election is real and extremely dangerous, and dangerous perhaps for Jews in particular. If Biden loses in November, I'm sure there will be many who will blame Israel. And if he does lose because of his policies on Gaza, it really is, I mean, I don't want to use hyperbole, but just at least as far as I'm concerned, the end of the world. But an extremist, violent America is dangerous for everyone, Jews included, and perhaps particularly for Jews.
Okay, let's go back in history a little bit, since we have the benefit of your historical expertise. That I think this is a very interesting question. The tragic history of Native Americans in the U.S. Often receives little attention, yet it has many parallels to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Why is the focus of the current student protest so outward rather than inward, especially given that many of the campuses are built on Native American lands, like Harvard, Columbia, Penn, MIT, Cornell, et cetera, et cetera?
I mean, the way I see it, students who've studied Native American history, whether formally in class or informally, independently, see what's happening now in Gaza as a 21st century version of what happened in the United States in the 17th, 18th, 19th, early 20th centuries. And I think their sense of urgency and obligation to stop the war in Gaza and their accusations of genocide and their characterization of the state of geopolitics here as settler colonialism stems from their sense that they were not there to stop the dispossession and extermination of Native Americans, but they are here now to stop the dispossession and extermination of Palestinians. And so I see how that history informs and inspires the tremendous passion that I see on college campuses. I do want to point out that, once again, history does not repeat itself. And I am happy to discuss elements of settler colonialism in the Zionist Israeli project. I don't think that these categories map onto the Israeli-Palestinian reality in the way that many Americans think they do. This is, and as a historian, and sometimes I think this is the main difference between historians and let's say literary critics or philosophers, we don't see the world in abstract categories. We see the world as composed of a virtually infinite kaleidoscope of human experiences. And what's happening in Israel-Palestine has some parallels in Native American and Euro-American dynamics, but is also quite different from them in the sense that many Jews living in Israel come from families and lineages which are indigenous to the region, that the Jewish people has a tradition of life in this region that dates back thousands of years. That many of the Jews who arrived here were refugees who had nowhere to go. I can speak for my own father, who got here in 1951, and he simply had nowhere to go. He lost his whole family in the Holocaust and was 16-year-old, an orphan, and literally had no country willing to take him in. And this wasn't much in 1951, but it was something. It was a place one could go to and be welcome in. And that's what he did. And that history needs to be taken into account. Jews weren't sent by Western empires to Palestine. They fled to Palestine because the United States wouldn't take them, and because European countries spat them out. Whether before 1939 or after 1945. And so I recognize the similarities. I think these are useful categories to be thinking through, but thinking through categories does not necessarily translate into taking one set of historical circumstances and thinking, okay, this is what I'm seeing now. No, you're seeing something else. You're seeing something very complex, very complicated, almost intractable, which has all sorts of characteristics from different modern historical phenomena. And we do, 20-year-old college students do their thing, but 47-year-old Israeli historians do something else, which is to think critically about all of these issues and try to come up with a nuanced picture of what's actually happening here and what could happen here. I think many young Americans who feel so passionately about Palestine feel passionately about Native American history too, and feel passionately about African American history. And I take their commitment very seriously. And there's a lot of criticism here, a lot of vitriol, a lot of caricaturing American college students protesting for Palestine as these anti-Semitic and ignorant, privileged young kids. I think and say none of these things. There's some measure of ignorance among some people and a great deal of knowledge and thoughtfulness among others. It doesn't mean that I necessarily agree with their analysis of the situation, but I understand where they're coming from. I want to meet them at a place which could generate useful, pragmatic solutions for the region.
Well, do you think they're being influenced by external elements that are enemies of Israel that are manipulating them?
Look, I mean, there's been a lot of conversation here about the organizing and funding of SJP chapters on college campuses. I know that the Wall Street Journal had a big story showing outside funding coming in. Look, the American Jewish community is an extraordinarily well-organized and well-funded community. And I think it's perfectly okay for the Palestinian community, for the Arab American community, for the Muslim American community to be organized and well-funded too. And if these SJP chapters are receiving funding from Arab countries, it's just what it is. Money flows freely through the world now. And I think there's nothing wrong morally or ethically about the fact that these pro-Palestinian lobbies are now organizing and enjoying support that is reminiscent of the kind of organization that we've seen in the American Jewish community for a century and more. It may be uncomfortable, but there's nothing fundamentally wrong with it.
Okay. Okay, so here's a really historical question. In the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln affirmed to both Americans and the world that the Civil War sacrifices would ensure democracy and freedom shall not perish from the earth. Very famous line. These principles have often guided U.S. foreign policy and military actions. How does U.S. intervention in the Gaza war align with these principles? And how would this intervention be affected if Israel's democracy were to erode?
One of the things that I always tell my students that's so interesting about studying U.S. history is the gap between these noble and beautiful ideals that we see expressed in the Declaration of Independence and the Gettysburg Address and Lincoln's second inaugural address, maybe even John Winthrop's City on a Hill. I mean, Lincoln is almost divine in how he writes. And there are many other really, really inspiring ways to say what the U.S. means and what the U.S. could be like and should be like. And often these ideals have resembled very little of what was happening on the ground in the United States. And slavery in the U.S. is in some ways more interesting than slavery in other places because the U.S. is the place where all men are created equal. According to Thomas Jefferson, the slaveholder, the father of enslaved children. And I think the United States has often fallen short, not just in its treatment of its own racial minorities, which has been, as we all know, horrific and horrifying, but it has failed in its foreign policy. I feel that the United States often chooses its own selfish interests over justice, and often prefers stronger powers, stronger rulers over their peoples. I think there's no denial that both in internal matters and in foreign policy, the US does not meet the standards that its greatest political philosophers and practitioners have set. But again, as a historian, we live in the real world and we're facing real choices. And I would have wanted the Biden administration to stop the war in Gaza a long time ago, and it hasn't. And for reasons that I try to lay out, I can go into it in more detail, though I think the audience's sense of this is pretty similar to my own. But I think at least there's some sort of fundamental humane instinct driving the foreign policy of the Biden administration. They could have abandoned Ukraine a long time ago. Supporting the Ukraine in its war with Russia is expensive, and it hasn't proven as effective as one would have hoped. And so in a world of imperfect choices, I'd still rather stay with these folks and push them to do more and to stand up to the current Israeli government and to impose a rational and humane vision on this region.
Okay, so switch for a second. So if hopefully not, but if Trump is elected, do you think there's a scenario where he would impose on Israel a recognition of the Palestinian state just because he wants the Saudi deal, or to win a Nobel Prize or something like that?
Like I always tell, when I need to give commentary on Trump in Israel, or when he was president, that's sort of most of the public speaking work that I did was try to analyze Trump. And at the end of the day, I really think that the people with the expertise required to understand and predict Donald Trump are psychiatrists. And I, sadly, that's not my degree, but I honestly cannot predict what he will do. And who will fill the kind of the crucial positions in a second Trump administration. I mean, who the hell knows? And so I'd prefer to take the fifth on this one, because I simply don't know how to answer it. I don't know anyone who does, honestly, but certainly not me.
We have another question about if he fulfills his threat to leave NATO. Again, it's predicting what the implications for Israel would be in the world. So if you're not, if that would be a stretch to predict that.
I see no reason for him not to leave NATO. He doesn't like NATO. He thinks NATO is expensive and useless. So why wouldn't he leave NATO? I really do mean what I said earlier, that we are literally holding on to the remnants of the post-Second World War order, and the re-election of Donald Trump will ensure that world order will be gone for good.
Okay, let me give you another question that we received from the
So hang
audience.
on, yeah, Mila, can I interject because I'm seeing a question here that I would love to answer in the
Sure.
chat. Gideon Yefet, what would you say to progressive people that are planning to vote for third-party candidates in 2024, like Jill Stein, Kennedy, Cornel West, etc.? I mean, here's what I have to say. I fully get the frustration with the Biden administration, which I share as someone who lives here and is raising children here. I keep urging people who are invested in this issue in the United States to think about, not about abstractions, to think about the actual people living here. How do we make sure that less people die and more people thrive? And I really, Cornel West was at Princeton when I was a grad student there. I teach his work. I love his work. This is not politics. Voting for Cornel West or Jill Stein, again, great respect. That will not advance life in this region. That will not advance practical solution that will make sure more people will stay alive. And I urge you to resist the urge, your urge. I urge you to resist your urge to vote in protest, because the alternative is not going to be Cornel West or Jill Stein, right? If Cornel West or Jill Stein had any chance of being elected president, I'd say absolutely go for it. We'll see if that can do something for this region, but that's not going to work. And that's not politics, my friends. That's that's emotional, I don't know, just kind of letting your feelings out into the world. It's not going to do anything for anyone who actually lives here. It's just going to create more damage, more death, more destruction. It will be enormously empowering to the Israeli right. I mean, maybe, I can say something about this. The Israeli right is clamoring for a second Trump administration. And right-wing Israeli politicians have been saying, oh, I'm so sick of Biden. He won't let us do this. He won't let us do that. We just need Trump back in power. Why would you give these people that gift of a second Trump administration? It will be catastrophic in ways that I can guarantee will make anyone who will vote for a third party candidate in a swing state. I mean, if you're in Massachusetts, fine, knock yourself out. But if you're in a swing state, if it actually matters, then please think about people and lives rather than, about how you feel about things, even if you feel terrible. I feel terrible too.
Don't throw your vote away, in other words, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Okay, so here's a sort of a question about Israeli politics, I guess you would call it. And I'm just reading it from my phones because it's hard for me to read it from the screen. Can you inform us about the current status of the Israeli left? The questioner, Gabriela Shelley, has read many reports that indicate that the Israeli left wing has shrunk to a very small percentage of the general electorate. Is that accurate? And if so, besides donating money to the New Israel Fund, what else can we do to help?
Okay, well, thank you for donating money to the New Israel Fund. It's God's work. NIF is actually doing God's work. And so thank you. Look, I will say two things. Yes, you're right. The Israeli left has shrunk to a rather slim portion of the electorate. However, a year ago, that was not the case. A year ago, the Israeli left was growing. The country was moving left. People in what we would call the center were starting to see the connection between Israeli policy in the occupied territories and the messianic nutcases who are leading it, the Ben Gvir, Smotriches, and Orit Struks of the world. And we started to see a real shift in the polls. We started to feel it in the demonstrations. And so the Israeli electorate, like any electorate, is movable, and it can be persuaded, it can be shaped, and we can't give up on the Israeli electorate. Trust me, I mean, no one is more angry at the Israeli electorate than I am. And yet I realize that the work that needs to be done is the work of persuasion and converting. And last year, frankly, because of right-wing overreach, we were starting to see that happen. And as a historian of the 19th century, I actually felt like the Israeli right was making the same mistake that the American right in 1857 and 1859 was making, which is overreach, which is saying, you know, we're not going to limit ourselves to what we have, which is slavery in the South. We want it all, you know, we want slavery nationally, we want the West, we want it in Nicaragua and in Cuba. And at that point, the mainstream public in the United States, which was not against slavery and was certainly not for Black rights, at that point, the public said, okay, enough. You people are pushing it, and you people are going to transform this country into something which we will not agree to. And last year, this is exactly what was happening. People were waking up to the reality that the right wing was transforming the country into a place they were no longer willing to accept. And so, you know, in the same way that 2023 was, up until October 7th, a year of a kind of a political miracle in Israel, I think that miracle could appear again. And I will, you know, I will hold out hope for that to happen. None of what has happened here over the past year and a half could have been predicted. Not the enormous public reawakening in the face of the judicial overhaul, nor the catastrophe of October 7th. And so I leave room for dynamism, for historical change, for the unexpected. And then the other thing I want to say about the Israeli left, and of course, you know, I'm now speaking in my own defense, is that we really are trying. You know, civil rights groups and human rights groups are working around the clock. There are local initiatives, there are national initiatives, there are people now protecting the trucks coming into Gaza from settler violence as they make their way from Jordan south. There are people, I just gave money the other day to someone who is buying food for a village near Jerusalem, which has basically been under siege since October 7th. People can't come in and go out and work, and they're hungry, and so they do have neighbors who are, you know, raising money and buying food and bringing in food. So there is work on the ground. I mean, we're not, you know, it's not, despair is really not an option here, and whoever has remained committed to the left is very much active, and the demonstrations are back. And a lot of the people who, in the wake of October 7th, were saying, you know what, I don't know anymore, and I can't, you know, I just can't take it all in, it's too much, are regaining their critical faculties and are back on the streets demonstrating. So we, you know, we need to figure out, and I think, you know, this is, as far as I'm concerned, the $64,000 or $1 million question is why is it that we have let the public swing so hard to the right? What, you know, where did it all go so terribly wrong? And how can we turn it around? And you know, countries change, people change, and we need to just keep doing that work, and hoping that the kind of political miracle that we saw here in 2023 will once again transpire.
Yeah, let's end on that very hopeful note, since we're just about out of time, and I don't think we really have time for another question. but I just want to thank you very much. I think we have a lot to think about from what you've told us and the questions that you've answered. And it's been a really interesting and informative webinar. And I know it's in the evening for you, and you probably are tired as well. So thank you so much for joining us. And we'll say goodbye to our audience now too.
Thank you. And thank you all for caring about this and for being involved in this. And I really am urging you not to give up and to realize that, supporting the cause of a liberal Israel is also supporting the Palestinian cause, whether it's the 20% of the public in Israel, which is Palestinian. Another, great ray of light in this moment of darkness is the ways in which alliances have held firm between Israelis and Palestinians within Israel, and between Jews and Palestinians, within Israel, and to not to give up on the prospect of this conflict being resolved and of Israel saving itself from being its worst version.
Great. Thank you.